I want to just acknowledge the faculty in the room. Particularly, we have some distinguished faculty here that I've also seen the past 3 days. Professor, our senior professor, Dr. Tan, I can't see where he is. Yes, Xiangyun Tan, wonderful to have you. And we have our Professor Emerita, Judy Balswick. So there may be others that I can't see online. We welcome you in special ways, but we're also very pleased to see our current faculty here. Thank you for your presence. And of course, our students, very glad for you that you're here. Alums are here as well. And we know that we have visitors and some of our staff are here. And we have friends of Fuller. So I hope that includes everybody, because if you didn't know you were a friend of Fuller, you already are now. I have been at Fuller for 25 years. President Goatley said, yeah, you're celebrating your silver anniversary as Fuller celebrates its 75th. That's a little scary, but I guess accurate. And the Integration Symposium over the years has just been one of the highlights. And to have a scholar researcher like Dr. Exline talking about her research on these things that are harder for folks to engage, that is just such an honor and treasure. So I am just excited in a whole new way, and I hope this is inspiring you to consider research in these areas. Your research, Dr. Exline, is groundbreaking. You are a phenomenal scholar. It's inspired us to probe deeper and enhance our understanding of aspects of spiritual experience that are often overlooked. It takes courage. She said a few things that gave you a window. It has taken courage to pursue these areas, and I thank you for that. I thank you for that, and the sacrifice of that. Your use of yourself, your story, images, and metaphors has been a special gift to us, both in helping us know you and in grounding the findings and stories that we will remember. You know, we remember the stories, and then we can place the findings around that. I'm looking forward today, particularly as you address the controversy related to spiritual struggles and healing. Even as we look forward to what you're going to be sharing related to spiritual struggles, I also wanted to give a shout out for your religious comfort and strain scale. We have used that in our work with psychiatric populations, and I do think the way in which you have measured religious comfort is very important. So anyone who's thinking about a master's or dissertation, keep that in mind. I then would simply want to say that to reflect on our personal relationship, I'm trying to think. We've known one another for over 20 years. Yeah, solid 20, 20 plus. That's right. Okay, good. You've got that. So throughout that time, your authenticity, your humility, and above all, your generosity as a scholar. Some people that are just so busy in their own work, they don't share, they don't engage. Julie, you've done that, and I've so appreciated that for me and other folks. So let us pray. Dear Lord, we are so thankful to have this opportunity to think about spiritual struggles and all of what we focused on this week. We're thankful that Dr. Exline is here with us to share not only her journey in Christ, but also how that has influenced her work. May it help to inspire us, motivate us to think maybe in some different and new ways about spiritual experience more broadly and spiritual struggles specifically. Dear Lord, as there's so much suffering that is really literally right in our face these days, locally, nationally, globally, the tragedies, I think our understanding about how spiritual struggles could even be more manifest in many ways is just so important these days, that we have some ways to make meaning, to understand, and even to question, Lord, because that's part of the process. Lord, we're thankful that you're a God who allows for that questioning, who understands that questioning. So now as we continue, we look forward to hearing approaches and perspectives that Dr. Exline will share that will help us respond to a troubled world and our troubled lives. Bless the conversations and the connections that will happen today. We ask all these things in your Son, Jesus' name. Amen.
Thank you, Dr. Abernathy. One of the things we love to do here at Fuller is also to give away resources. So I want to point you again to, if you go to the Fuller website and you then go into the academic section and you go into the School of Psychology and you keep following the trail there to integration, you will find that our integration lecture series are all posted online, and you can watch videos of people from the last 10, 15 years or so. As well as there's publications there that you could look at. And I wanted to bring to your attention, in the last 10 years, we've published 4 different books related to the Integration Lecture Series. Most recently, last year, Dr. Seong-Young Tan, his brand new book, A Christian Approach to Counseling and Psychotherapy. Dr. Cameron Lee, Integration as Integrity. Janelle Paris from Messiah, The Good News About Conflict, and Marie Hoffman, When the Roll is Called. So there's lots of resources out there. Please go to our website. Please go to Fuller Studio, and you can find lots of resources related to the integration of psychology and theology. I'm going to introduce Dr. Exline a little more briefly today, since we've done that several times already, but we are so happy to have you. Dr. Exline serves as professor of the Psychology of Religion and Spirituality in the Department of Psychological Sciences at Case Western University in Cleveland, Ohio. Her research interests, as you know, are the interface of clinical, social, and personality psychology, with a special focus on topics involving spirituality, religion, and existential concerns. She's past president of the Society for the Psychology of Religion and Spirituality, and I highly recommend to you not only her many, many articles, but her more recent book with Kenneth Pargament, Working with Spiritual Struggles in Psychotherapy from Research to Practice. Now, one last ritual we have here, which is a ritual that I started because I'm in charge, is that on the Friday, I always read a poem. I read a poem because I think it captures our imagination in ways that story, like you've been doing, also captures our attention. And I attempt to read a poem that somehow grapples with or tackles some of the issues that we've been dealing with, especially today and yesterday around spiritual struggles. This is a poem by the Pulitzer Prize-winning poet Franz Wright. Franz Wright is the only son whose father also won a Pulitzer Prize for poetry. He grew up not religious, converted to Catholicism later in his life. He grew up in an abusive home. He developed serious addictions. He was hospitalized. In the middle of that, he kept writing poetry and found his way to Catholicism, where he would say he would walk into Mass and a poem would emerge in his mind. Franz Wright also went on to work in psychiatric hospitals and volunteer at a home for bereaved children. His poetry is powerful, full of ideas of spiritual struggle. And this is his poem called My Peace I Leave. The next life will be darker than this, so we must prepare a light. Help me change, here on my knees in the hell of my heart, on its cold star apart. Because if we say we are your followers while in reality walking in darkness, we lie and do not live according to the truth. And so I won't lie, and I will live according to the truth. Acknowledge I mostly live cut off and walk in darkness. Help me. I still need to know there is a place. The temple still stands, the unknowable housed, the infinite somewhere. Help me find the horizontal portal, the misplaced sky blue book, which is peace. This world didn't give me this word, but the world cannot take it away. Will you please welcome with me Dr. Julie Exline?
Thank you so much, Dr. Strawn, Dr. Abernathy. I really appreciate all the support of the whole team here at Fuller. I've been just so overjoyed to be with you and so appreciative that so many of you are still sticking it out and being with us here today on Friday as well. I do hope that the donuts helped. So today's talk is going to probably be a little bit less dense with references and things. A lot of the key information about the research studies I felt compelled to get into the slides. But today is going to be, we'll have some of that content, but this is going to be a little bit more practically focused, clinically focused. But also, I just want to be clear that some of my suggestions and things that I'm offering here are also more tentative. I don't have, we don't have intervention studies testing all of these ideas that I'm going to be putting out here. So this is going to be based on a combination of research, clinical experience. A lot of it comes from Ken Pargament's clinical experience and things that went into the book, and just my own experience dealing with struggles and talking with people, not just clients, but friends, family, other people about struggles. So I just want to go back to this metaphor of the nautilus shell that I mentioned the other day, this idea of how we keep growing, often kind of centered around, certain points or issues, and that all of the elements of our past story are an important part of who we are, and to not just try to cut off those parts that are uncomfortable or difficult, but to find ways to integrate them. And also that we can't go back. Once you've grown into the next chamber, you can't cram yourself back into an earlier one, even though we might want to do that sometimes and go back to a simpler time. And this image of the nautilus shell, like I said, is John Templeton Foundation, who I'm very grateful to, who's funded our work on spiritual struggles, supernatural attributions, gratitude to God. Very grateful to them. This is their image. And also, I've just recently been exposed to some ideas of what's been called integral Christianity, kind of an evolutionary framed set of ideas about spirituality and Christianity, based heavily on Ken Wilber. I'm not an expert on Ken Wilber, but I found a lot of these ideas appealing as I've learned about them recently. And also, there's a book by Wilkie and Noreen Au here in the LA area at a Jesuit university. This idea of the discerning heart. This is a book that I came across when I was being trained to be a spiritual director in the Ignatian tradition. And they also use this metaphor of the nautilus shell. I'm going to be mentioning a few ideas from their book today that I found really helpful. In fact, let's just start off here. So one thing that I do like to do is I originally went into psychology thinking that I wanted to be a self-help person, like a person who wrote self-help books and did that kind of thing. I actually really enjoy that. So today, even though I'm not going to be able to give you time to sit and journal as much as I would like to do that, I want to be encouraging you to think about how these things apply to you in your own life, not just in the lives of clients, but for starting with yourself. So the Au's came up with this idea of a personal compass, where there are these different directions that represent different things that are going on in our lives. And they encourage people to journal about these. And in the north, you've got what they call the North Star. These are the stabilizing types of forces in your life. It could be in your spiritual life or your life more generally. This is part of what Ken Pargament might call the person's orienting system. So these are like your guiding light, your guiding light types of things, sources of love, comfort, and security, your deepest values. These are the things you feel like are really stable, that you can really hold on to, things that are foundational. Then we've got the South, which they call sunny exposure. These are areas where you've got lively energy and passion. There's some sustained imagination, creativity. You've got excitement about these topics, but they're things that you're into now. And then the East, the rising sun, these are the areas where you have new energy. You might feel some stirrings or some yearnings or something maybe new that you might be being called to. And there's a sense of movement or change. And maybe you can't even tell what it is yet. So sometimes this might actually be a little bit uncomfortable. You feel like something is changing, something new might be coming in, but you aren't always quite sure what that's going to be. These are the new things that are coming up. And then in the west, the setting sun, the different things where we have to say goodbye, and things are ending, changing. We've got to let go. Things related to grief and loss can be here. But even, remember this classic book by, I think it's William Bridges, Transitions, talking about how in major life transitions, there's loss involved. Even if there are exciting new things happening, it often means having to say goodbye to something else. So these are themes that we haven't looked at any of this empirically in reference to the struggles ideas, but just things I'd be encouraging you to be thinking about. Because as I've reflected on my own history personally and with religion and spirituality, I have found it helpful to occasionally go through and journal about some of these things. So again, these are the points on their personal compass. So just continuing along today, we're going to be focusing on spiritual struggles again, but things that are a little more practical, applied. Like we know what struggles are now. We have a sense of what predicts them, and we've taken a closer look at anger at God. The ideas I'm going to be talking about today, many of them come from my own experience. Some of them also come from the book that Ken and I wrote. And some of them are in the report that we wrote for Templeton, the free report, but the book definitely goes into more detail on these clinical things. The report was more focused on research. So I just mentioned this really briefly yesterday. Does spiritual struggle lead to growth? Can we assume that when these struggles happen, at least we or whoever's suffering is going to grow from them? But there's some tricky issues around this. So one has to do with how we measure growth, things like post-traumatic growth, stress-related growth, spiritual growth. And Aranda Jayawickrama has done a lot of the really cool theorizing and work here. A really important question, especially when you're trying to look at these things empirically, is can we trust people's subjective self-reports of having grown? So people are looking back, and might they just be reframing things in their experience to make it seem like they've grown? But how do we know if somebody's actually grown? This is actually quite tricky because growth is a value-based thing. Do we have to in some way document personality change over time to show growth? Now those are expensive studies. That's tough, and people might not always be thinking about personality change, but I just want to mention, I'll be talking about growth. It really is tricky to measure as it's subjective, and people might have this tendency to look back over times when they've suffered and say, well, at least they'll reduce their dissonance. Like it was worth it somehow because I grew. So that people might be inclined to do those types of things just to cope with something difficult that's happened. So let's just take a look. There's value judgments in what we consider to be growth. So which one of these is growth? Learning to focus on the here and now. Again, mindfulness and just getting focused on this world, or focus more on the hereafter, the life after this one. Which of these is growth? Getting serious about spiritual warfare? Or is this dualism, this idea of dualism behind everything just part of the problem? People have very different opinions about that. And it's going to lead you in pretty different directions. Which one of these is growth? To more fully embrace your faith tradition and go in deeper and deeper? Or maybe decide that it's time to leave a particular religious community or change your beliefs. And I would argue that in different situations, in different contexts, any of these could be growth, but you can see how the values come in. I know in a lot of the early work that we were doing on this, there was this thought that disengaging from religion, or a particular religious community would be seen as like a negative outcome. That would be indicating spiritual decline. But it might actually be what somebody needs. You don't know what's going on in that religious community. Also, our Western individualist psychological mindset tends to focus so much on what we can do. We have to do the things so that we grow. And there's the question of, are we the only initiators of growth? We did a study a few years ago and found that among Christians, this sense of having grown from struggle is linked with the helpful things that we've done, positive religious coping, like reframing things more positively, seeking support from your religious community. But also with this idea that God is doing things to help you grow too, that it's not just me, that it's God. So there's this idea that I'm sure most of you have heard of, this idea of I have my part and God has God's part, my part and God's part. So we do have some empirical evidence that many people do see God is directly playing a role in their growth, and it's not just coping stuff that they're doing. There's a couple of references on that. And the focus tends to be on God because so much of the research focuses on Christian populations, and the focus just tends to be very theistic. But some people also report spiritual growth or help from struggles by things that we've made other mention of, things like mystical and near-death experiences, encounters with angels, which some Christian traditions talk about angels a lot and other ones hardly talk about them at all, or contact with spirits, like a spirit of a deceased loved one, animal, or nature spirits. You may or may not be comfortable with any of these things. I'm just saying, these are some of the types of external factors that some people do think are contributing to spiritual transformation for them. So if we just think about God, we might be missing important parts of some people's experience. Also, there's the question of whether some kinds of growth actually require struggle. And Shema Saratoprek, who was a PhD student with me, graduated a couple years ago, her master's was based on this idea called spiritual jihad. So when people hear the word jihad, a lot of times what comes to mind are, things like suicide bombings or terrorism or holy war. But the term jihad, it does have this focus on a battle, but a distinction that gets made, and it's emphasized especially within the Sufi strands of Islam, is this idea of a lesser jihad, which is more the external conflict and fighting and disagreements with other people, fighting for the faith, and might sometimes include some of those holy war things. That's seen as the lesser jihad. The greater jihad is the one that's taking place inside the self, where it's a struggle between the higher and lower parts of the self. So you could even see that as, the part that's being influenced by God or the Holy Spirit and the part that's being influenced by the devil. Sometimes they do use those attributions around these different parts of the self or al-nafs. And the ultimate aim here is that it's basically a type of moral struggle where you are trying to cultivate virtue and draw closer to God, but it's framed in this struggle way, that this is a important struggle that we need to experience within ourselves. So back to this question, does spiritual struggle lead to growth? You can see it's complicated, and the empirical findings are very, very mixed. When you look at people at one point in time, we've got about an equal number of studies, not just ours, but other people's, that suggests that higher scores on negative religious coping or spiritual struggle are associated with more post-traumatic growth. Other studies say less, others show no relationship. It's not a clear and consistent thing. So just wanting to reiterate an important point from yesterday, it's really important to not sentimentalize spiritual struggles and just assume that these are going to lead to growth. But can they lead to growth? And there definitely does seem to be potential here. So if we think about growth as being some type of transformation, thinking back to things like the post-traumatic growth literature, these are just a few of the things that people will list. A change in life priorities, discovery of certain personal strengths, finding a new life path, experiencing a greater sense of closeness with others, and there are more. So some of the different measures of post-traumatic and spiritual growth will emphasize things like this. And yes, people do report these types of things after struggles. Not always, but often. So I'm just going to very quickly go through the 6 types of struggle that we happened to capture in our little religious and spiritual struggle scale, and just speculate about ways that these different struggles might lead to growth. I'm sure you can think of other ideas too. So, anger at God or other divine struggles, how could this foster growth? Well, something I'm going to talk about in a few minutes is that honestly being able to disclose these struggles to another person or to God and working through it might actually increase the sense of intimacy with God. And sometimes people might need to experience some discomfort with their ideas about God or their feelings in order to challenge old or simplistic ideas about God. So some of you might be familiar with R.B. Phillips' classic book, Your God is Too Small. The idea that many of us have images of God as, as a parent or as a judge or as a slot machine or, all these different images that people have, genie in a bottle, that we wouldn't maybe consciously endorse that, but they're based on these ideas that we have that are very limited about how God works. And sometimes we might have to have some experiences that violate these beliefs that, oh, if I'm good, nothing bad will happen to me. We need to grow past those things. And sometimes feeling frustrated or impatient with God or disappointed, or even angry might be a part of that. Moral struggles and guilt, what good is it? Well, again, there could be lots of reasons, but a few things are that sometimes we have to experience guilt to have a sense of our moral limitations, to cultivate more of a sense of moral humility rather than self-righteous pride. And when we're able to accept responsibility for things that we've done that are wrong and try to make things right with other people, this can encourage repentance and reconciliation, which are key parts, certainly, of the Christian faith, and things that among humans in general, these are going to be beneficial to be able to repair relationships. You've got to sometimes feel some of that discomfort in order to engage in that relational repair. A crisis of ultimate meaning. Again, this is the one that's most linked with things like depression, anxiety, suicidality. So what could be good about that? Sometimes we might need to see the emptiness of certain values. We climb up this ladder of success and find that it's leaning against the wrong wall. You've probably heard that expression before. But we might find that we've been chasing after status, money, power, playing some kind of a game with our lives, only to find out that, there's really better choices I could be making. Where is this all leading? And that might be really uncomfortable, but might lead to some powerful reordering of our priorities. And sometimes people might have to have a crisis in order to really seek out what is deeply meaningful about life. What might be my purpose? If you don't have some challenges, you might not think about that. It might just kind of drift through life. Doubt and confusion could have benefits too. So very important. Doubts are just a reflection that you aren't sure if something is true. So you can't just go around believing everything everybody tells you. Think of all the misinformation floating around on the internet. You want to be able to have critical thinking, and you want to doubt some of the things that you're told. And with religious teachings, even if you feel very clear about a certain sacred tradition or text being authoritative, there's still going to be things that you hear about it from other people that maybe should be doubted or questioned, because chances are people aren't going to have the interpretation exactly right. And doubt is certainly correlates positively, usually like 0.3 or so, with this quest orientation toward religion, which is the idea that our faith is something that we expect to continue to evolve and change over time, and that we embrace that change. Going back to this idea that so many of our supernatural beliefs and religious beliefs come from socialization. We believe certain things because we've been taught. Sometimes you have to experience that doubt or confusion to clarify, what is it that I actually believe versus what I've been told. On this trip, I'm reading a book by Karen Armstrong, really well-known religious studies professor and writer, called The Spiral Staircase, talking about her background as a nun and how she tried to live this life as a nun in what sounds to me like a very repressive, sometimes even abusive situation, the struggles that she experienced, and then having to figure out once she left from that part of her life, try to reorient herself and figure out what did she actually believe. So that's a page turner. I can't tell you where it's going because I'm only on chapter 4. Okay. Interpersonal struggles with religion, super common. Most of us have had them either with people in our own communities or we have struggles with what other people are saying about religion. Some people might be angry about at religious leaders or about religious teachings, or just having disagreements with people about doctrinal issues. How could they help? Well, conflict is how we cultivate a lot of these interpersonally focused virtues. It's like we have to have sandpaper in our relationships in order to learn how to love, forgive, be patient. I'm sure you've heard the joke about don't pray for patience, like bad stuff's going to start happening. I don't want to do that. And back when I was studying humility, every time I would go to give a talk on it, something bad would happen before. Like one time I dropped my curling iron on my face that morning. One time I was super sleep deprived and like didn't have any way of timing my talk and it was all messed up. Oh, and once it was when we first had cell phones and I was texting while walking, which I wasn't used to doing. And right before the talk, I walked into the bathroom and looked up and it was a bunch of guys. So, and then of course, like they were in the talk, a few minutes later, it's like, hey, nice to see you again. So for any of these virtues, a lot of times it requires uncomfortable things to make them happen, right? And when religious systems become corrupt, you could become part of the solution. Sometimes people are afraid to speak up against things that they think might be going wrong in their congregation or with their leadership, things that they might feel like, I should speak up, but this is the church, I'm not supposed to say anything. Maybe there is some change or reforming that's really required, and you could be an important part of that, but that takes a lot of courage. And demonic struggles and appraisals. I talked about this a little bit the other day, but let's just come back to this. These sound really scary and uncomfortable. What could possibly be helpful about that? One thing that Richard Beck looked at in a really cool paper, this is about 15 years ago, was the idea that if people can blame the devil, they can keep God in the clear. If you can blame the devil for things that are going wrong, then you don't have to deal with anger at God. And so that can be psychologically comfortable for people. Also less likely sometimes to blame yourself, like, it's the devil made me do it. I'm not saying this is always healthy, but I'm saying these are things that people might find appealing about blaming the devil. And this idea of being in a cosmic battle can really be empowering. And remember, this includes for women too, even though guys often find that funny. I had somebody laugh in my face once when I mentioned something about spiritual warfare and how for women that could be like empowering. The person assumed I was joking and laughed at me. So I'm going to give some really, really broad general tips about intervention for spiritual struggle, and I just need to reiterate, these are tentative. They're based in research, but we don't have a single intervention for spiritual struggle. Ken and some of his graduate students have done some nice work. They made a winding road intervention for spiritual struggles about 10 years ago. And it has some empirical validation, but there's so many types of spiritual struggles. You think about it, ultimate meaning struggles are very different from demonic struggles. Those are very different from interpersonal struggles with religion. And feeling like God is punishing you is pretty different from just being angry at God for being unfair. So the winding road intervention that Ken and his students made was pretty broad, and a lot of it was focused on the types of ideas I'll be talking about here. But when people say, well, why aren't there interventions for these things? Well, part of it is because intervention research is really hard to do, and I tend to do more basic research. But some of it is because the struggles are also different. Plus, depending on your belief system, whether you're trying to make something that's faith-based and has theological assumptions baked into it, that's going to be specialized for your niche. It's not going to be something that could just be given to anybody. So there's all kinds of great work that could be done in this area. I'm excited to have people work on this. So with that said, here are some ideas. The first thing, which we've been hearing over and over, heard a lot about this yesterday in the wonderful comments by Dr. Williams and Grace. this idea of providing a safe space. So you can just let people know that spiritual struggles are very common. Remember the stat from yesterday that somewhere around 70% of US adults report that they've experienced spiritual struggles, and around a half or more are saying, yeah, in the last few weeks I've had some. These are super common. You can do so much good for somebody just by providing this safe space. I'm going to say a little bit more about that, and validating that, normalizing the struggles. I'm going to come back to this question that I raised as a controversy yesterday of whether people think it's okay to be mad at God. Keep in mind, I can't get up here and tell you whether it's okay to be mad at God or not. That's not my job. But what do people think about it? And I'm repeating some material here. So people often do see anger toward God as being morally wrong, especially more devout believers, people who are older, Christians, and maybe especially Protestants in comparison to some other groups, and African Americans. More concern that it's morally unacceptable to be angry at God. And we haven't published on this, but the data do seem to suggest Muslims also pretty nervous about anger at God, and Jewish individuals more comfortable because of the legacy of lament that is often embraced more in Jewish worship and teaching than it is in Christian versions. So what happens, though, when people see anger toward God or other divine struggles or spiritual struggles as being wrong? Well, it goes underground. So if people see anger toward God or some other struggle like doubt as being wrong, they might not admit it to other people, which means what we're probably seeing is underreporting of it on our surveys, not overreporting. Why would they tell a researcher? Very importantly, might not admit it to themselves. I'm sure that some of you have talked to people, worked with people, maybe experienced this yourself, where anger toward God was there, but it was just too scary. I mean, some of the people who I've talked to, I think were the most angry at God, would have vehemently denied it. It was just too scary to go there. And people are going to be afraid to admit it to God in many places. We had an article about this. So again, the numbers that I've given, there was a national survey, it's a little bit old now, that we had drawn from, it's about 20 years ago. About 2/3 of people in the US were saying that they had been angry at God at some point in their lives. This is probably underreporting. But it can really become a forbidden or taboo topic. I've had people come up to me after talks like, do we really need to talk about this? Why can't we focus more on the positive side of spirituality? You could tell that people were nervous about it, that a lightning bolt was going to come down. But what happens when anger is suppressed? So obviously there are many reasons for depression, and I'm not trying to say that this is the only reason. But if you think about internalizing blame rather than externalizing, we know that people who have internalizing disorders are the ones who are going to feel more guilty, lower self-esteem, ashamed, get more depressed. This could be part of that pattern for somebody, not being able to acknowledge anger toward other people or toward God. And as a result, you can imagine that a person's perceived relationship with God could start to seem kind of cold and dry. Like there's an elephant in the room that's not being addressed. We're kind of skating around this issue. And the issue then is going to remain unresolved because it's not being addressed. It's kind of being swept under the rug. What happens though when people tell somebody? So we did a study of this where we had adults who had told others about their anger toward God. That was the group. And the good news is most of them said that they got supportive responses, like, it's okay, I've felt that way myself, normalizing responses. But about half reported some level of unsupportive responses. So these were usually small, like on a 0 to 10 scale, it might have been like a 2. But people, still half of people said they felt kind of judged, kind of shamed, kind of like you need to get over this. This isn't acceptable. You don't want to hang around here. And why does that matter? Now, this is based on correlational cross-sectional data. This is not an experiment. It's not longitudinal, so I want to be careful about that. We're looking at associations here. But if I tell you that I'm angry at God, you give me a supportive response. Like, I felt that way myself. So many people feel that way. people who said they got a supportive response, were more likely to approach God and more likely to report that this incident that involved suffering or struggle had actually strengthened their faith. So it's like by giving people permission to be angry at God, they're more able to go to God and be like, can we work this out? It gives you think of it in attachment terms. It gives people a sense of security to do that. But the unsupportive responses were associated with more attempts to suppress anger. The anger tended to continue. People were more likely to turn away from God and exit the relationship, and there was more substance use. So you might recognize the church lady that from Saturday Night Live long ago, this idea of the shaming kind of unsupportive judgment. So the people who reported the most resilient relationships with God, the ones that could bounce back after they had some anger, were certain people. So these beliefs that it's okay or good to assert myself with God. So this might include complaining, asking why. I'm just going to go back to that. A lot of times people are afraid of questioning God because they're afraid that means showing disrespect or questioning God's authority. And there's an idea that actually fed into this study that I'm citing here. It was from a Beth Moore Bible study that I was in probably 20 years ago, where Beth Moore talked about this issue of questioning God and how there was an important difference between questioning God's authority versus just asking questions like, why is this happening? And kind of more that lament idea. I thought that was really helpful, and we did find support for it here. So asking God why and maybe complaining was associated with a sense the relationship was good and had bounced back. But at the same time, it's wrong to turn away from God. So I'm not going to question God's authority. I'm not going to leave the relationship. I'm not going to withdraw or ignore. I'm not going to rebel. So just thinking about assertiveness in human relationships, showing respect for yourself and the other. It's the same kind of logic here. So to help provide a safe space for people, just try to be aware of your own struggles, biases, triggers, some of those lenses that we talked about of how you might interpret their experience and things that might be triggered in you if somebody seems to be expressing doubts, maybe ones that you're having or don't want to deal with. And I think that it's valuable to normalize struggles before asking about them. This has been shown in the past with some of the research that was done back in the 60s on sexual practices, where they talked about how it was certain sexual behaviors are really common. A lot of people do this. Well, how often do you do this? When they normalized it first, people were much more likely to report certain types of behaviors. So if you normalize struggles, a lot of people in your situation would be having spiritual struggles or would be feeling angry at God. That's really common. I wonder if you've ever felt anything like that. So you say first things to normalize it, rather than coming out and saying, you wouldn't happen to be angry at God, would you? But do ask about them, because people often really benefit from having a chance to share. And remember that non-religious people and even people who don't believe in God may have spiritual struggles too. That was something I talked about yesterday and gave some references for that. And obviously we want to explore them respectfully without judging. The second tip I want to give is to be wary of the quick fix. And this is basic clinical training. But still, it's tempting sometimes. People are coming in, you feel pressured, especially if you're doing some kind of pastorally engaged care, you might feel pressured to come up with a Bible verse or something that's going to help them to feel better when people are really suffering. I just wanted to share a little story here about, from my own life. I call it Bijou's story. So this is the rescue dog, Bijou, who we had when I was in graduate school. You can see how old, you probably can't see this. You can see how old that computer is. It has an actual floppy disk drive, like the floppy kind. I'm there with Bijou. And I remember when I was in grad school that I would sit at that desk there and write. And I'd be, typing into my computer. And I remember thinking, Bijou and I share a huge amount of our DNA. And so much of what we know about human psychology comes from rats and pigeons and all kinds of other animals. So we have a lot in common, but there's absolutely no way I could ever explain to Bijou what I'm doing, why I'm sitting here tapping my fingers on these keys. And then I thought, well, and that's just a normal everyday event. What about something that's painful for Bijou, like when we have to take Bijou to the vet to get a shot? There's no way that I can say to Bijou, Bijou, we're doing this to inoculate you against future disease. That's why you're having to go in this nasty smelling place and go up on this cold table and get this shot. There's no way Bijou is ever going to get it. And then I thought, and this isn't just about, you could make an argument that people are fundamentally different from these other animals, but I thought, even when we have our own children, right? If you've got a toddler, they don't know what you're doing on the keyboard, and they're not going to understand about the shot. And they're part of our same species, right? And a lot of us can't even explain, or understand highly technical things that aren't in our own field, right? But yet, and this was my thought that helped me, I thought, but yet we feel like we should be able to figure out what God's doing and what God's reasons and purposes are. What, is God like on our same level that we should be able to figure it out? But we're so quick to say, well, I can't see how a loving God could possibly do, But it might be like the Bijou story where there's a reason that we can't see. Now, I found that to be a very comforting story. I like that. I still use that in my life now. But it really backfired when I tried to use this with other people. I remember having a therapy client who was also from a Christian background and had lost her father. And I was talking with her about the loss and some of her feelings about it. And I ended up telling the Bijou story, just thinking, this is my magic bullet, right? Everybody loves a Bijou story. And she said, yeah, well, God might have his plan and everything, but it sure would be nice if he'd let me in on it. And then I remembered this particular woman didn't have the same kind of loving, secure attachment relationship with her father and in her life that I did. It's like, oh, I'm able to trust God's intentions as being benevolent and kind of think about, even despite some of the scary stuff I was taught, basically feel God is loving because of my own experience. And she didn't have that experience, so the story did not connect at all. So it kind of requires that positive God image to be able to trust God for that story to work. I also told the story to a colleague once at a social psych conference, and he said, if you told that little story to a Jew whose family had been through the Holocaust, they'd break a bottle over your head. He said, we want justice. I don't want to hear your little story about, how God has his plan. I was like, yikes! I mean, if somebody here likes the Bijou story, that's great. But I'm not gonna come preach it to you. I can tell you that. So what I learned from this is that there's not a simple cure-all for anger at God. You might have a favorite theological fix that works for others. I found some people are really attracted by ideas like, when God created the world, God put certain limitations on his power so that certain things can't be prevented. Some of the process theology approaches and things like that some people really like, and other people are like, God's sovereign. I don't agree with that. I can't go with that. And there's all these other ways that people can explain things that are satisfying for them, but it's not going to connect with everybody. So you got to be really careful about imposing your own theological assumptions, especially in diverse environments. But remember, I was talking to a woman who was also a Christian. So it's not just about the diversity of the religious traditions. It's about the diversity of our own experience, our personality, our attachment style, all of these things. This is something else that we heard about yesterday from Dr. Williams. Certainly chaplains are experts at this. And I would imagine many of you in the room who've worked with people with crisis are used to this type of thinking too. So when people are in the midst of a major crisis, trying to come in with a logical fix-it solution, a Bible verse, a quick thing, often isn't going to help. What people need in that crisis time is that simple caring and acceptance. You're not alone. I'm here with you. They need that gift of presence. There's also a concept from Taoism called Wu Wei that I sometimes find helpful to think about, which is just the idea of kind of going with the natural flow of the situation and seeing, rather than forcing some type of intervention or strategy, to just kind of go and see where, follow the person that you're talking with. Don't force it. Wait patiently for the best time to take action. And then when you see it, be ready to act, to make an interpretation or a suggestion, reflect back, whatever it is. The third tip is to encourage people to explore their struggles privately. Remember, people don't always want to talk about everything. And sometimes, like, I'm much more of a journaler and I process things much more internally. And sometimes when you're in therapy or talking to somebody, you feel like you have to come up with stuff. And sometimes you just need time to do it yourself. So you could encourage people to engage in these prayer-based strategies. I did have a student who did a master's thesis on this like 15 years ago, and we didn't publish it, but we had some success with it. So just encouraging people to express their concerns to God in an open and honest way. And remember that God already knows. So again, it's that thing of we think that God doesn't know because we're not bringing it up. And logically, we know that's not true, but we still act like, if I just don't bring this up, it's going to be okay. And then imagine God responding with love and acceptance to what is being said. So there's other techniques for getting in touch too. Things like other forms of meditation, using sacred text like the Lament Psalms, encouraging people to write a letter to God, which they may or may not share with you, journaling, and other forms of creative expression. So for some people, something like drawing a picture is going to be helpful. And psychologists and other counselor type people, we often are very into words, and we tend to assume everybody wants to talk about everything. So what other roads to growth and healing might there be that don't rely on words or this logical type of analysis? So just a few ideas. So for some people, just sitting in silence is great. Music, which could be anything from classical to rock and roll. I know that for myself, I've had a lot of cool spiritual insights. We're resonating with really hard rock and heavy metal music. I mean, it can be whatever. It doesn't have to be spiritual music. It doesn't have to be religious music. Visual arts, physical movement of various types. You may or may not be comfortable with this. Some people find energy work and things like Reiki to be really helpful. This type of body work. Or different forms of human touch. And in some cases, in close relationships, even sexual experiences might lead to a sacred moment that could be very healing for somebody who's having relational issues. And just joyful, playful experiences. It doesn't always have to be this serious, let's sit and think about this. And finally, the symbols and metaphors, which we keep coming back to. I'll use some more of those as we finish up here. So the fourth tip is to aim toward, again, the theme of the Integration Symposium, wholeness, integration, and connection. This has been more and more of a theme in Ken Pargament's writing. The whole theme of integration and wholeness is something that he's been writing more and more about lately. So when we first started studying spiritual struggles and trying to look at them longitudinally and all that, we kind of had this idea of framing them as a fork in the road. You have a struggle, it's a fork in the road in your life. You could either go towards spiritual growth or decline. But then now we're thinking of it more as both and. Many struggles are going to lead to both growth and decline. There's going to be growth in some areas and decline in others. You might have to change some beliefs or leave a community or encounter some difficult emotions, but then there's still growth. So I don't think it's helpful to be like, okay, we got to make sure that you grow and we got to make sure there's no decline. Losses and brokenness are part of life, right? But where's the life and the beauty in the situation? So encouraging people, not imposing it on them, but encouraging them to look for what's life-giving in the situation. What meaning can they take from it? What is there to be grateful for? But here it's very important to normalize and validate the pain and distress first. You don't want to just jump right into this because it could seem like you're just putting a smiley face on and dismissing their distress. So people need to feel safe first before you start encouraging them to look at the bright side. And there's this question of how can these light and shadow parts of the person's experience come together? And again, metaphors and symbols might help. People might have their favorites that they come up with. So some of the ones that I like are thinking about struggles as necessary seasons in life. And light and shadow has been a theme that has carried throughout my own work and my own thinking a lot. They're both beautiful. We need them both, at least here in this world. Or the idea of a heroic journey, that framing something as a journey that person's going through in a heroic sort of mode. There's going to be trials and obstacles that you're going to encounter. They're part of the story. And you just happen to be talking to somebody at the time where they're really struggling and they have that scary or difficult thing coming up. So they have these trials. They're also going to have storms along the way. It's part of the story, right? It'd be a pretty boring movie or story if there wasn't something like this. And can you have heroes without their villains? You have to maybe have some opposition. Again, remembering that in order to grow, we might need some of that opposition at times. And the final tip is just to consider many ways to frame what success is when you're trying to work through a spiritual struggle or a life struggle, or to help someone else do it. So you might get some reduction in symptoms of depression or anxiety, but for the struggle itself, I just think it's really important to keep in mind that the struggles might not go away. These are sorrow, struggle, distress are natural parts of life. So in Christianity, we do hear about this world as being a place of trials, and just being a person of faith isn't going to make that go away. And within Buddhism, there's the whole idea of life being about suffering and learning to respond by reducing attachments and increasing things like compassion and loving kindness. So our experience and our response to the struggle could be a big part of what we're going to be contributing to the world. So you don't just want to get better and get it over with. Like, what can you learn from this? There's a Japanese art called kintsugi, the art of precious scars. And I literally just bought a kintsugi bowl, and it arrived the day before I came out on this trip. I've been meaning to do it for a few years, but I thought I need to have one of these sitting on my shelf to remind me. So the idea here is that when we suffer and experience brokenness, we can be made whole again. But and here they use gold filigree or other precious metals to make it beautiful. But you can still see the scars. The scars are part of the beauty of the piece, but there's still scars. It's not that they've just been all kind of papered over. So in thinking back over our conversations and our time together, I hope you'll be able to think about some of the things that have challenged you, things that are going on in your own life where you're being called to growth. And I just wanted to tell you really fast some of our new research directions, things that we're working on in the spiritual struggle area. All these things about the demonic beliefs, hell, afterlife beliefs are a big focus in our work now, upcoming work. Christian nationalism and political polarization and how supernatural beliefs can feed into these things. Experiences and struggles that people have who identify as LGBTQ+, just so much of this going on and so much struggle around religion challenges for people. And finally, going back to some of my stories from yesterday, how to forgive the church for hurting you. So a lot of my own experience of getting into struggles has been because of some of the difficulties that I had coming out of my particular fundamentalist church. I definitely have some scars from that. One of my current students for her master's is going to be looking at how to forgive members of, or even the whole religious community that you might have left. We've documented some of the anger that people experience, but how can we help people to heal from this? Forgiveness might, in some cases, be an important part of that. But we don't want to rush people to that. We want to acknowledge their hurt and anger first. So I just encourage you to think about your own life, bringing it back to you again. What images, symbols, or metaphors inspire you? How might the compass look for you? Where are your roots? Where's your pain? And where do you have this energy? And what are you waiting for? It's going to keep you from getting into this. What are you waiting for? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Exline. Rich stuff. We'll get to talk some more in a few moments here. But before I introduce our respondents, we always on Friday take a moment to announce a paper competition that we hold every year. It's called the Travis Award Presentation. It's for a paper at the interface of psychology and theology. And we students they submit those papers. We do a blind rating by several of our faculty members. And this year we had our first tie ever that I can remember. So we've decided, hey, let's let them both brag about it, right? So I'd like to announce, unfortunately, neither winner could be here today. One's on internship and one was going through match day today, but I contacted them both. They were sorry they couldn't be here, but they're thrilled to be winners. The winners this year are Rachel Bendorf for her paper, Eschatology's Role in Trauma Treatment, and Carrie Adams, I and Thou, Rehumanization in Forensic Psychology. So yes, let's... Those titles give you a hint of some of the stuff our students are working on. Pretty cool. So let me introduce our respondents for today. Dr. Steve Simpson is a psychologist and associate professor in the School of Psychology and Marriage and Family Therapy here at Fuller. He has published a number of articles and books, including What Women Wish You Knew About Dating, A Single Guy's Guide to Romantic Relationships, and Assaulted by Joy, The Redemption of a Cynic, and Single Sex Stories, Tales of Unmarried Sexuality and Faith. He has served as the clinical director at Fuller Psychological and Family Services and the director of clinical training in the School of Psychology. He leads a research lab on gender, sexuality, and religion, and he is the lead editor for the forthcoming Eros and Psyche, Existential Perspectives on Sexuality. He specializes in work with couples, sexual problems, ADHD, and anxiety disorders. Our student respondent is Eltis Lynn. She's a fifth-year PhD student whose study emphasizes religious perfectionism, and we're happy to say that she has been placed in an internship this year for the fall. So please come, Dr. Simpson.
Anyone who's taken my classes knows that I have an aversion to PowerPoint, so you should all feel very special today. Probably also why it looks like a template from about 2002. So I want to talk about what happens when the struggle is no longer real, so to speak, when people lose faith. And in discussing this, I'm not just talking about somebody who grew up without faith, somebody who grew up in a non-religious home. I'm talking about someone for whom faith is at the center of their life, and then that changes and they lose that because it represents a transformation and a transition that is massive, as we'll see in just a moment. And this is happening more and more. According to this Gallup poll, church attendance, church membership has declined 23% since the year 2000. It's a massive drop. And so in the United States, we're dealing increasingly with a population that is not religious. And what I've seen in my clinical practice, what I've even seen with some of my students, is people for whom faith was once at the center of their life and they are starting to lose that faith. Sometimes it does mean just leaving a particular religious community or a particular faith tradition, but increasingly I'm seeing people lean into agnosticism and atheism. So I'm going to talk today about this from the perspective of psychotherapy and providing psychotherapy for Christians, for religious folk who lose their faith. And one of the things in having this discussion that's crucial to remember is that religious faith is about more than belief. And so losing faith involves much more than just changing one's mind. It's not just like changing a political position or something like that. It's a forfeiture of culture, community, identity. It involves multiple losses. And so we're going to talk about some of these losses today as considerations for psychotherapy and working with clients who've lost their faith. So we're going to talk about losses in the area of culture, community, identity, and we're also going to talk about some existential losses. In listening to Dr. Exline's wonderful talks this week, I've often thought several times we must have grown up in the same church, or at least one that's very similar. And I'm so happy that she's doing this work. It's so important for the church. I really resonated yesterday when she was talking about. We saw movies about the rapture. Worse, we saw movies about after the rapture about what they did to the people who were left behind. One delightful movie ended with somebody's head getting cut off. And so I would come home as well, and if nobody was in the house, I was like, oh, I've been left behind. I'm gonna have to battle the Antichrist. It's not gonna go well. But that's how much church was a part of my identity and how much it was part of my culture. When somebody loses religious faith, they lose a culture. Of course, they lose church. And as I've just mentioned, church can be such a big part of somebody's life. The rituals associated with church. I have clients who've become agnostic that will still find themselves praying reflexively. When they're under stress or having a problem, they'll just find themselves falling back into that immediately without thinking. Of course, it changes holidays. For some people, it can change their sense of what it means to be patriotic or affiliated with a certain country. In God we trust is on our money. God bless America. God is a part of our national culture in the United States in some ways, in name at least. Music is such a big part of church and such a big part of our thought and emotional life. I have a client who's become agnostic, and he's missed church so much that he's tried going to a Unitarian church, but he says the music is terrible, and he doesn't want to go back. So he said that, not me. I don't know anything about their music. And just pastimes. I don't know about you all, but for me, lunch after church on Sundays was always just a big part of my week. There was a place called Camelot Steakhouse in Fayette Mall in Kentucky, and it was a cafeteria-style steakhouse. You'd order your steak at the beginning of the line, get your other food, and then your steak would be waiting at the end. It was magical. But, we would go there after church in our nice clothes, and it would just be the nice setup for our Sunday nap. What happens to pastimes like that when you lose your faith? That things that are structures in your life. Oops, went the wrong way. And of course, there's a massive interpersonal loss. There's a loss of community. People lose friends. I've worked with so many clients who've been in leadership roles in their church. And their whole social network consisted of other volunteers, church members, and when they change their beliefs, they're not excommunicated as such. There's not a literal excommunication, but there's often a relational excommunication where people regard them differently and just treat them as not as close anymore. And that robs them of stability. That robs them of support system. And of course, family relationships can change as well. For those of us who have grown up in the Christian church, for those of us that have been heavily involved in it, for those of us for whom faith is a central part of who we are, losing belief means losing a massive part of your identity. If your identity is centered in Christ and then you lose your faith in Christ, what then? If your testimony, if your story is based on your faith, what happens once you lose your faith? Self-worth. We talk so much about God's love providing a sense of self-worth. If I no longer believe in God, where is my source of self-worth now? These are questions that are often worked through well after somebody changes their belief instead of happening as part of the process. And of course, there are massive existential losses as well. If you grew up a Christian, if you grew up evangelical, then probably like me, a big part of your life has been searching for God's plan for your life. What is God's will for my life? What is God's purpose for my life? What's its meaning? What's my telos? What's the, what's the purpose? What's the end of the story? The Christian narrative, the gospel provides answers to these things. Wonderful, rich answers. But when a person loses their faith, it opens up this existential vacuum. And it can lead to depression. It can lead to anxiety. It can lead to feelings of isolation. And so these are all examples of just the multiple losses that people experience. And one of the biggest ones is having to think again about death and what happens when we die. And this changes someone's telos, someone's existential telos. They no longer think of death as leading to this eternity with God, with their loved ones. They think of death as an ultimate ending. And that changes everything that comes before it. That changes someone's timeline. And again, a massive, massive loss. So let's talk about psychotherapy a bit with clients that, again, not someone who's never had a faith, but someone who's losing their faith. You need to lead with empathy instead of apologetics, which for someone like me can be hard. I have an apologetics machine gun with bullets from C.S. Lewis, Thomas Aquinas, and Bono, just to name a few, okay? It's funny, I'm not known as the most religious faculty member, but put me around non-religious people and suddenly I become very zealous. And I'm glad to have the argument with you. So this is something that and it can feel like it's coming from a noble place. There's a part of me that feels like, well, if I can just convince this person to believe in God again, everything will be okay. It doesn't happen. The reason I know is that occasionally clients will actually want the debate. They'll instigate it, which I've come to learn means something. At first, I thought it meant, hey, they want me to change their mind. That has never happened. But what I think they're doing is they're making sure. They're going to a therapist, a primary person in their life, someone that they respect. And it's like, if Steve can't knock this down, then if my therapist, my psychologist, this guy with degrees in theology and psychology, if I don't come out of the arguments with him changing, then I'm not going to change. And I had to learn that that's what happened. However, I think as Christian therapists, we are actually in a really unique position to help people who lose faith. We know what it's like to have the centrality of Christ in your life. We know about the culture. We know the losses involved. And so even if we haven't experienced identical losses, we still have our faith, we can empathize. Probably better than a secular psychologist who has no belief, who might not take it as seriously. So a big part of psychotherapy is going to be validating and processing all of these losses that we've talked about, which is going to take some time, in service of developing a brand new narrative. These folks have to come up with a new timeline. They've been knocked off the one they were on, they thought they were on, and now they're having to come up with a new story again. They're looking for a new moral compass. The north, south, east, and west has changed for them now, and so they need to rewrite that story. And ultimately, the hope is they can start to look back on their faith with fondness, that they can look on their religious experience as part of their story and accept it instead of seeing it as something that was a mistake or false, but an important part of who they are. And community. This is, I think, the most difficult that I've experienced in working with people who lose faith. Finding a new community, having to go through trial and error, like my client who went to the Unitarian Church, tried to find other ways of connection that ultimately just don't satisfy as much at the beginning, and so it's a process. But I'd like to leave you with maybe a slightly different thought about this. I wonder if they have to lose their community. I wonder if there's not a way they can keep it. And I'm going to give you an example of that. When I was a teenager, I liked Christian punk, okay? None of this Amy Grant, Michael W. Smith stuff. I wanted something loud and weird, okay? And so my favorite Christian punk band was a band called Undercover. They formed right here in Riverside, California. And the leader of the band, their spokesperson and songwriter, is a guy named Ojo Taylor. I love it. Ojo is a nice punk 80s name. Ojo has prayed with me more than once. I would see Ojo at music festivals, and he would preach and talk about apologetics. He was wonderful and just informed so much of my faith in so many ways. Last year, I decided to see what had happened to him, and I found him on Facebook, and I friended him on Facebook. He accepted. Ojo is now an atheist, and he is just as outspoken about his agnosticism and atheism as he was about his faith. I kind of want to tell him sometime, you're still a fundamentalist, dude, in some ways, just a different kind. But I found him right when Undercover was getting ready to have a reunion, and this summer I went to see them in Anaheim, and he played with them. And Ojo would always give a little sermon in the middle of the show. This time, he just got up and said, God is love. Do you believe that? Then love one another. And then he began to share how, even though he had lost his faith, he still felt part of this community, this little Southern California community of punk rock Christians that all are losing their hair and have pot bellies now. But he says they feel like they accept me, they love me. Some of them tell me I'm going to hell, but for the most part, I feel this sense of acceptance and love and community. I haven't lost my church, even though I don't believe anymore. And that's just something that I think we can be mindful of, whether it's therapists, clergy, but if people change their minds about God, they can still be a part of the body of Christ. Now, I don't pretend to know what that means theologically. I've got a master's degree, just enough knowledge to be dangerous. But I do think it's worth thinking about how, if someone changes their mind, do they have to have all these losses? Is there a way we can mitigate those losses for them and still show them the love of Christ even when they no longer believe? Thank you all so much for your kind attention. Oh no. It's a party. Thank you. Sorry about that.
No. Is it on? No? Okay. Good morning. I'm thankful for the opportunity to be here, and I want to thank Dr. Exline for just talking about the clinical aspect of religious struggles and the importance of normalize people's experience and creating a safe space. I think it is powerful for people to know that they're not weird, they're not crazy, and they're not alone. And I also want to thank Dr. Simpson. I think your PowerPoint looks pretty cool, and I think I also find your talk to be very relevant and profound. And I resonate with Dr. Esline's acknowledgement of the complexity when it comes to intervention, especially our awareness of the theological and cultural assumptions as helpers, especially in this diverse and globalized world. So today I'm hoping to bring in some perspectives as someone who was born and raised in Taiwan, and I didn't grow up in church. I grew up in temples, not that I live in temples, but I grew up worshiping other gods different than the Christian God. And also a psych student who is also a pastor's wife, however that means. So as an international student from Taiwan, where the culture is heavily influenced by Buddhism, Taoism, folk religion, and Confucianism, I see how people's understanding and experience of religious struggle differ greatly from those in the West. For example, in Taiwan, it is very common for people to make spiritual attribution. or feel like they're hearing from gods, like small g gods. I want to be careful about the my word choice. I know people have different reactions about this, so I apologize if I offend anyone. And so the struggles people might have in a context like Taiwan might have to do with switch allegiance or to discern if their experience is from the quote unquote Christian God or other deities or natural, supernatural forces most people in the culture believe. And it is not uncommon for people to have demonic struggles or frame suffering because it's a Buddhist influenced culture. So frame suffering as a type of measurement for spiritual growth. So I want to share these pictures taken by my uncle with my aunt and nephew on the right. They're seeking supernatural guidance, right? So this captures how I was raised growing up and how my nephew in this picture was being raised. So the question for people in this context would be, how do people discern the voice of the Holy Spirit from those of other spirits? And I have to also acknowledge my discomfort and struggle with showing these pictures because I feel uncomfortable because bringing in an expression of other gods in a Christian context in Taiwan might be frowned upon. Because showing these pictures has spiritual meaning to it, even though in the West, people might think of me as just illustrating culture. But it means more in the context of Taiwan or other parts in Asia. And also people in Taiwan Christians in Taiwan would consciously choose not to associate themselves with these false gods, even in this form. And also in the context of Asia, spiritual struggle for Christians might also look like questions around what is Christian faith and what is Western culture. Or after becoming a Christian, the question might be how to navigate the tension of, if I may borrow the title of this book, and I'm sure many of you know this book, How to Follow Jesus Without Dishonoring Your Parents. So in this form, spiritual struggle is experienced within an interpersonal context that's embedded in a Confucianism-based culture. Or if I may rephrase, based on my ministry experience in Taiwan, how to follow Jesus while honoring your ancestors and maintaining harmony with one's family and friends. So to support growth from spiritual struggle, I believe context matters. And it is important that we have a deep and nuanced understanding of the unique situation each individual is in so that we can understand what growth looks like for each person. And even like Dr. Exline just talked about, how do we measure them? And for my dissertation, I study clergy wives, and many people have asked and comment on my topic and asked me why, and my reason is because it's very personal. So I study this population and the relationship between their perceived perfectionism from congregation they serve and their psychological well-being. Research shows that for this particular population, feelings of isolation and loneliness is a common spiritual struggle, especially when they are projected on realistic expectations and when the church emphasizes the pursuit of perfection because our Heavenly Father is perfect. So the result of my study show that among the 218 clergy wives who are predominantly Asian, the more they experience that their congregation wants them to be perfect, and the more they feel criticized for falling short of that perfect standard, the more likely they are to experience depression, emotional exhaustion, and feelings of loneliness. So this shows that in addition to context, the identity of an individual plays an important part in the nature of the spiritual struggle they experience. And in the case of clergy wives, their struggle are shaped by people's expectations for women and her existence in relation to herself, her spouse, others, and the larger ministry context. So my point here is that people's identities, including their role in the religious setting and other factors like age, gender, sexuality, race, socioeconomic status, marital status, and even the context of the United States immigration status, make their religious struggle and the questions they ask different. And in Dr. Exline, Dr. Parkman's recent book, they also point out that in the United States, spiritual struggles are more common for people who are more socially marginalized. So to support an individual with spiritual struggle, it is important, I believe, to know that not only context matters, identity factors matter. And to support people's healing and growth, our job is to first understand and help people feel seen and understood in their unique struggles. As a clinician, the most common religious struggle I encounter in the therapy room is the pain caused by interpersonal religious struggles. And unfortunately, many of these relational struggles I have seen are spiritual abuse from a religious leader or institution and their attempts to control and manipulate. Unfortunately, spiritual abuse is far more common than they are being discussed. So let's look at this study done in the UK by Oakley and Kinman that surveyed into people's church experience and spiritual abuse. And the results indicated that among the 502 respondents reporting their previous church experience, 74% stated that they had felt damaged by a church experience. 84% felt manipulated, at least sometimes, at their previous church experience. 69% state that scripture was used to control behavior, and 49% state that they had been made to feel shame or blame. And the consequence of religious abuse is often traumatic, affecting people's spiritual, psychological, and physical well-being, leaving people feel hurt, ashamed, betrayed, confused, afraid, making people question their beliefs about God, others, themselves, and the world, and often exacerbating other forms of religious struggles. So what does healing or growth look like for people who have experienced spiritual abuse or trauma? It might look like knowing that they are not alone, and knowing that trauma is embodied. Traumatized people chronically feel unsafe inside their bodies, and they learn to hide from themselves. So growth might look like developing the ability to listen to their body, identify triggers, notice how their body reacts to certain signals, and to regulate them, the trauma reactions, rather than blame or force themselves. It might also look like separating themselves from the abusive environment and prioritizing making space for healing and safety, and allowing time to recover and restore before they are ready to have dialogues about their experience. And growth might also look like feeling empowered to examine the power structure within their religious institution and identify harmful patterns. So to support people who have experienced religious trauma, it is important for us as helpers to simply believe what people have to say and not minimize their experience. We need to first ask, what happened to you, rather than what's wrong with you. We also need to do our inner work so that we can be present in people's struggles and pain. In his book, The Gift of Therapy, Yalom says, how can one possibly guide others in an examination of the deep structure of mind and existence without simultaneously examining oneself? Nor is it possible to ask a patient to focus upon interpersonal relatedness without examining one's own modes of relating. So this reminds us to support people from religious struggle. We need to look deeper into our own experience of spiritual struggles, the lenses through which we understand human experiences, our biases and assumptions, our ways of relating to God and others, who and where we are culturally, socially, and spiritually, and the inner work we need to do, continue doing so that we can be a good fellow traveler that provides safety, trust, and support for those who need to know they are not alone in their journey toward connectedness and wholeness. Thank you.
On. Thank you again for two amazing responses today. And we're going to jump in here to some questions. And I'm going to begin with a question that I think is coming from outside the U.S. So again, thank you for joining us. Does expressing one's anger towards God subside with the passing of time? Do we have any sense of that there's a kind of decline in anger toward God?
Well, I think the clearer finding that we would have is that if people try to suppress it, then the anger tends to remain unresolved. So we don't have direct data showing that if people express it, that it declines, but that kind of logic would be consistent with things like exposure therapy. You know, you face the thing that you're afraid of, and it should, you know, I would expect that the intensity of it would reduce over time, that it would get, that it would provide some emotional relief to be able to do that. One thing that I would suggest, again, that we don't have data on this point super directly, but not just to express the anger, but to imagine God responding with love and acceptance.
Yeah, Steve or Eltis?
I think the one thing I would add, and this is actually something I got from my own therapist, when I would be angry with God, I'd have a lot of why questions. And one of the things she said is like, I don't think you actually want answers to your why. I think you're just mad. And I think you just need to, instead of asking God, why is this happening, just tell God that you're angry at him, that it's happening. And that made a big difference for me.
I think it depends. I think depends on what do you do when time passes, and I think it's hard to make a feeling go away by just ignore it. Yeah, so I'm not sure.
Yeah. This question says, we have a number of students here at the symposium. Are there ways of thinking about spiritual struggle from a developmental perspective? And I'm not sure if that's a kind of longitudinal question or if the maybe particular developmental stages people are in where spiritual struggles and anger at God could be more complicated or challenging.
I'm not a developmental person, but if you think about things like moral development or faith development, that people can maybe get, we have these vestiges from our pasts. So there might be things going on inside a person from an earlier developmental stage where you're very focused on fear of punishment, for example, from authority figures, or in-group, out-group types of thinking, which, you know, depending on the system, but if you're looking at Fowler's system or Kohlberg or something, they would say those are, you know, steps along the developmental way, but not the most mature forms of, you know, spiritual development. So I think some people can get stuck in those things more easily and fear God's punishment more, fear breaking rules, or get very much into the loyalty stuff of I can't question my group and my church is better than other groups. And so I think that there's a lot of cool work that could be done there, but I'm not a developmental person, and a lot of times determining where somebody is with those stages requires like lengthy interviews, and it's tricky work. Others might have other thoughts.
I agree as well. The only thing I would add is that just developmentally, we each have different needs at different stages, and I think that probably it would make sense to me that those spiritual struggles would align just with the different developmental needs at each stage.
Great. This question is, if a friend is having spiritual struggles with Christianity, where would you suggest they begin getting help? A chaplain, a pastor, psychologist?
I'd love for someone else to take this one.
Well, I think depending on their comfort level, we can present all the options and pros and cons and have them make that choice themselves.
Yeah, I think it depends on who the pastor or the psychologist is. To a large extent, I think, yeah, my students hear me say this all the time, it depends. But I think, you know, exactly like Eltis said, that just finding somebody's comfort level and what's going to meet their needs best at the time.
Yeah, I think there's always the risk with clergy. If you don't know who the person is, there's a chance that somebody might try to come in with scriptures or teachings and kind of get into that fix-it mode or try to correct their orthodoxy. A therapist, if they're not trained in talking about spiritual things, there's no guarantee of how that's going to go. And yet, to throw another wrench in the works, spiritual directors, are another group of people that evangelicals might be less familiar with this tradition, but spiritual directors are available in at least most communities, certainly in bigger cities. And they can really be great with talking with people about spiritual issues in a very open kind of way.
Yeah. This is kind of a complicated one, but I want to bring it up because you have mentioned, and Steve, you mentioned as well in different, maybe a little different ways, that even atheists can have spiritual struggles. So how do we help a friend who's an atheist having a spiritual struggle?
So much of that depends on what the struggle is. I mean, is it a struggle around anger at a religious community or hurts from somebody's religious past? Sometimes some of the work on kind of recovering from religious trauma can be helpful for people who've disengaged from religion and have these hurts if they've experienced spiritual abuse or religious trauma. I'm not an expert on what all those resources are, but they're getting to be very popular topics. And Altos, I was so glad that you mentioned those topics. But then there's all kinds of, they could be having doubt struggles or moral struggles. That's the thing, is there's so many different types of struggles. My advice really wouldn't be any different from talking to anyone else. Just hear them out, what's going on, hear the background, what's going into this, and don't try to convert them, like you were saying, Steve.
I mean, I'd say just empathy first. Just show them that you understand and show them that you support them. A former professor that we had here, systematics, Ray Anderson, one of the things that he liked to say is that whatever somebody was going through, he would be their accomplice. That they could say whatever they're going through, whatever the changes they're going through, that they could tell people that Ray Anderson from Fuller Seminary was their accomplice. And so being a good accomplice, I think, sounds kind of naughty, but yeah.
Yeah, and also help your friend know that you hear them, you're there for them, you want to support them, and you care about them. I think that's important.
It's great. Julie, you mentioned Kenneth Pargament's Winding Road intervention. Are you aware of any faith communities that are engaging in that, like in a corporate way?
I can't answer that question, I'm sorry. It's a great question, but I don't know the answer.
Right. So write Kenneth Pargament at Bowling Green. That's where Ken's at still, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. This is a bit challenging if you haven't figured that out yet, what I'm trying to do. Some of these questions I'm not. Here's one directed at Steve. Steve, over 70% of those who identify as fundamentalist Christians have read part or all of the Left Behind series. How would you intervene in a therapeutic milieu concerning how the image of Christ may create psychological symptoms? Answer the question. Answer the question you hear.
Okay. Well, the first thing I need to say is that even though I was very into eschatology, very into end times. Like I knew Jesus was coming back in 1982. I'd read The Late Great Planet Earth, and that's what it said, and that's what was going to happen. So when the Left Behind series came out, even though my theology was different, I ate those books up. Because I read them as adventure books. I'm not answering the question. I think, again, it's the same thing. Be respectful, help understand the appeal. Understand why somebody is drawn to that. And have empathy. There are, really, the Left Behind series is a wonderful narrative in a lot of ways. Because it gives us this ultimate final conflict with a happy ending. And that's what we all want. We want a happy ending. And so I think just showing empathy for why somebody is drawn to those books before jumping into challenging their theology about it.
And maybe, I think as you're talking, it's helping me make sense of a couple other questions here. Whereas I think that sometimes, and I'm going to try to phrase this as a question, sometimes maybe people from outside the psychology, counseling community, and they think of Christian therapists or counselors, they think part of what our job is to evangelize or proselytize. So there's some questions in here about, You know, if we're Christians, shouldn't we be helping people get over the struggle and get back to Jesus? Can you say anything about that?
Me? No,
And
no, no,
all
no.
of you, yes. Yeah.
I'm pretty
Again,
sure he was
answer the
looking at
question you
you.
want to answer.
It's a very complicated issue. I mean, it gets, well, first off the top of the list there, it gets into ethical issues in terms of the practice of psychotherapy. You can't use it as an opportunity to proselytize. Having said that, I think if somebody's faith journey is taking them, to a place where they have questions, where maybe they decide they want somebody to pray with them, I think Christian therapists are in a unique position to provide that kind of support. But evangelizing somebody just gets very, very messy in a lot of ways.
And I also think the question is, how do you define mission? Is it like explicitly evangelize and talking about God and convert people, or is it you embody the presence of God when you're with other people? And also, how do you define a successful witness or mission? Is it through you, people get to experience the beauty and shalom of God, or is it like people have to pray that prayer of conversion with you? I think it plays, that shapes how you would approach therapy or counseling.
Yeah, I could see. I'm just picturing again, as I was raised in the fundamentalist church with such a focus on evangelism, and I think there's a lot of fear sometimes of missing an opportunity to help somebody to come to Christ or to come back to Christ. And I think sometimes, as anybody in a helping role, including a therapist, you might feel that pressure, like I have to. It's kind of part of that. I have to fix this. I have to make sure that this person comes back to Jesus. So I agree with the ethical issues that are being mentioned here, but I can understand how for some therapists they would just feel a lot of pressure that to make that happen, and that they would feel like they were neglecting their roles as Christians if they weren't trying to steer the person back to Christ. So I'm just trying to acknowledge the challenge in the question there. I personally, if I were in a psychotherapy type of role, would the ethical thing would be there, where I would not try to persuade the person, getting them to talk more about their own experiences. But then I think that there might also be a certain amount of surrendering, releasing, trusting that a therapist might benefit from doing, that I'm not responsible for this person's salvation. It's not my job to get them back. And I think sometimes we just feel such a sense of responsibility around it that I just want to acknowledge that this is really hard for therapists.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, Julie, because I think you're right. And I think a lot of our students come in with that feeling like, oh, I'm failing. I'm not really doing the ultimate work here, rather than maybe a penultimate work. Or I'm helping, with the soil and the planting, and it's going to be, again, the Holy Spirit, right, who does the convicting, who calls people back to repentance, if that is what needs to happen, or back to, we don't even know. This is a great question, I think. We've been talking a lot about individualistic healing. I'd love to hear any insights the panelists might have about kind of a more communal or community-based kind of way to think about working through spiritual struggles, anger towards God. Any thoughts about that? Again, there may not be empirical evidence, but you're three wise people. What can you tell us about that?
I think it's a wonderful question, and it's a great new horizon for research and just areas for people to think about. With the book that Ken and I wrote, and with so much of the research, it's focused on therapy and focusing on things at a more individual level. But certainly there's all kinds of religious trauma at the level of communities, marginalized communities, ones that have been, places where one group has taken over another, all kinds of doubts that take place at a community level. Just think about all the mixing of religion and politics and how whole communities are kind of torn asunder and don't know what to believe. I don't know exactly what the interventions would look like, if it's like things that would come out through psychoeducation or sermons, but I love the question, and thinking about these things as not just being individual struggles, I think is a really important dimension.
I can share from my experience attending a church that really cares about a collective healing. So the church would organize events to take people on trips and to learn about history and having dialogues and creating opportunities for people to sit around tables to have difficult conversations. So through different events and opportunities to foster a more communal sense of healing. And I think it's hard work, it's important work. I don't have research or clinical data to support, but from my own participation, I think it is very needed, and it's valuable work.
I know as a psychotherapist, the change that I can make working with somebody individually is always going to pale in comparison to change that takes place on a large scale with their community embedded in their life. And so I don't have the answers either about the interventions, but I know we need to think that way. We need to start thinking collectively and not just in terms of the individual.
Yeah, thank you for that. Once again, friends, I'm sorry we can't get to all the questions. There's so many good ones in there, and I hope we'll be able to stay in dialogue. Before we thank everyone, I just want to make sure you hear these important closing announcements, okay, to this year's integration. The first thing I want to let you know is about the 2024 Integration Symposium. Next year, third week of February, make sure you check the dates for that, February 21 through 23. This symposium will be about the integration of psychology and theology for the church, which will feature some of our very own Fuller Seminary faculty from both of our schools, and it promises to be an amazing time. We really want to give psychology back to the world, to the church, to ministry settings, and so we hope that it will attract many people who are not only professionals in the field, but people working in ministry settings and pastors and the like. And so please make note of that. Remember, if you're receiving CE units here in Travis, you need to stamp out as you leave and drop off your CE evaluation forms. Remember, if you're doing that online, you're going to be sent evaluation forms for you to fill out this afternoon. We are actually, unfortunately, canceling our in-person alumni luncheon today, but I do want to let you know if you're a prospective student here for the open house, you can meet Susan at the registration table right there out there in the breezeway, and you'll walk over to the library for lunch. If you've missed any of the symposium or you want to rewatch it, the contents will be available on YouTube via links that will be in the Eventbrite email. If you register for that, you will get those sent to you. In addition, Fuller Studio is pleased to offer a selection of the recordings to be released in the months following the event. You should get an update on that as well. And as I mentioned, past integration symposiums are also available online. I also want to remind you one more, that you're invited to participate in the newly launched research program, which is a partnership between SOPMFT and SMT at the Brehm Center today. It's focused on spirituality and art. If you're interested, anytime today between noon and 4, you can go across the street, catty corner, 509 East Walnut. And the process takes about 45 to 60 minutes, and you will receive a $20 Amazon gift card for being part of that. So we want you to be a part of that if you're interested, and I know our researchers would love to have more participants. Will you please give a big Fuller thank you to Dr. Julie Exline? 3 amazing days, and again to our respondents today as well. Again, thank you to the Fuller Events team for coordinating all of this, all our respondents. Thank you for being here, and we pray you have a wonderful day and keep staying in touch with Fuller Theological Seminary.